Picture this. You're walking through golden corridors, so magnificent they could make angels weep with envy. Crystal chandeliers catch the morning light like captured rainbows, casting dancing shadows on walls adorned with the finest silk tapestries money could buy. The air should smell of roses and jasmine, of luxury and refinement. Instead, your nose is assaulted by something so putrid, so overwhelmingly foul, that you instinctively cover your face and wonder if someone has died nearby. Welcome to the most beautiful prison ever built, the Palace of Versailles in the year 1685, where beneath layers of the finest French lace and behind fans painted by master artists, lived women whose daily reality would shock you to your very core. These weren't peasant women struggling in hovels. These were queens, duchesses, and countesses, the most privileged women in all of Europe. Yet their intimate lives were filled with horrors that would make a modern woman faint. What I'm about to tell you isn't fiction. It's documented history that's been carefully buried beneath centuries of romantic fairy tales about royal life. The real story of how these women lived, suffered, and somehow maintained their dignity while trapped in a world of unimaginable filth and degradation. Before we begin this journey together, I want you to imagine you're there with me, walking through these halls, witnessing what no history book dares to describe in full detail. And if you find yourself as captivated by these untold stories as I am, please consider subscribing to join our community of history lovers. And don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts. I read every single one. Let me take you back to a Tuesday morning in October 1687. The Duchess of Orleans, Elizabeth Charlotte, awakens in her chambers. She's considered one of the most beautiful women in France, sought after by poets and painters alike. Her dress for today's court presentation cost more than most families see in a lifetime. Yet as she sits up in her four-poster bed, draped in silk that kings would envy, she hasn't touched water, not for bathing, in over 6 weeks. You see, what we consider the most basic human necessity, cleanliness, was viewed by these women as dangerous, even deadly. The royal physicians, educated at the finest universities in Europe, genuinely believed that warm water was poison to the human body. They taught that bathing opened your pores like tiny doorways, inviting disease and death to enter your very soul. The church reinforced this fear, preaching that public baths were dens of sin, where decent women lost their virtue along with their dirt. So, Elizabeth Charlotte, like every other lady of the court, relied on what they called dry cleaning. She would take a cloth, not dampened with water, mind you, but with wine, vinegar, or sometimes her own saliva, and wipe down her face, hands, and, if she was feeling particularly thorough, her neck. That was it. That was her morning routine. The irony was almost cruel. These women spent fortunes on perfumes imported from the far corners of the earth, rose oil from Bulgaria, jasmine essence from India, amber from the Baltic shores. They drenched themselves in these fragrances not to enhance their natural scent, but to mask an odor so overwhelming that visitors from other courts would literally gag when meeting them for the first time. The German ambassador to France wrote in his private diary, which I found in the archives of Munich, that approaching a French noblewoman was like walking toward a beautiful painting hung over a cesspit. He described how these magnificent creatures, adorned in jewels worth kingdoms, would leave a trail of stench so powerful that servants would rush to open windows after they passed. But the tragedy wasn't just the smell, it was what this lack of hygiene did to their bodies. Their skin, hidden beneath layers of powder made from lead and mercury, was often covered in rashes, boils, and infections that never properly healed. Many developed a condition called rose disease, angry red welts that spread across their bodies, caused by the combination of filth, harsh chemicals, and restrictive clothing that trapped moisture and bacteria against their skin for months at a time. Now, you might wonder, surely they had proper facilities. Surely the most magnificent palace in Europe had adequate accommodations for basic human needs. The answer would horrify you. The Palace of Versailles, this architectural marvel that housed over 3,000 people on any given day, had exactly 12 proper toilets. 12 for 3,000 people. And most of those were reserved for the king and his immediate male relatives. What did this mean for our Duchess Elizabeth Charlotte and her fellow court ladies? It meant that when nature called, they had 3 options, each more degrading than the last. Option 1, the chamber pot. These small ceramic bowls were kept under beds, behind tapestries, or in small closets. When you finished your business, you or your servant would carry it to the nearest window and simply empty it onto the street below. The palace grounds were so contaminated with human waste that special workers, called night soil men, were employed to rake it away each morning before the king took his daily walk. But option 3 was perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. Many of the women would simply hold it for hours, sometimes entire days, because the alternative was too humiliating to bear. They would suffer through court ceremonies, elaborate dinners, and dancing until dawn, their bodies in agony, rather than excuse themselves to attend to basic human needs. The Madame de Maintenon, King Louis XIV's secret wife, once fainted during a 4-hour court ceremony because she had been holding her bladder for so long that her body simply gave up. When she came to, the first thing she whispered to her lady-in-waiting wasn't about her health or her embarrassment. It was, "Did anyone see me leave?" This brings us to something that might be even shocking than their bathroom habits: their hair. In our time, we might spend an hour on our hair for a special occasion. These women spent days, literally days, having their hair arranged into what can only be described as architectural marvels. We're talking about hairstyles that stood 3 feet tall, decorated with miniature gardens, tiny working ships complete with sails, and even small bird cages with live birds singing inside. To achieve these impossible heights, they used everything you can imagine, and several things you probably can't. Wire frameworks served as the foundation, over which they would pile their own hair, hair purchased from peasant women, horsehair, sheep's wool, and cotton padding. All of this was held together with pomade made from beef fat, pig lard, and sometimes human fat purchased from executioners after public beheadings. Here's where the story takes a truly nightmarish turn. Once these elaborate styles were completed, a process that could take up to 8 hours and cost more than a craftsman earned in a year, they were meant to last for weeks, sometimes months. The women couldn't wash their hair, couldn't take down the style, couldn't even sleep lying down. They slept sitting up in specially designed chairs, their necks supported by wooden blocks. And what happened to hair covered in animal fat and left unwashed for weeks on end? It became a paradise for vermin. Lice weren't just common, they were expected, accepted, even fashionable in their own twisted way. The finest silversmiths in Paris made a fortune crafting elaborate lice rakes, long-handled silver claws designed to scratch itchy scalps without disturbing the hairstyle. These tools were so common that they were given as gifts at weddings and were often featured in family portraits. But lice were just the beginning. Mice would nest in the taller hairstyles, attracted by the food scraps that would inevitably fall into the elaborate constructions during meals. The Duchess of Fontages once discovered an entire family of mice had made their home in her hair during a 3-week period when she couldn't take down her style because she was sitting for a royal portrait. Some women developed what physicians called scalp rot, a condition where their actual scalp would begin to decay beneath the weight and filth of their hair arrangements. The lucky ones only lost patches of hair. The unlucky ones lost pieces of their skull. Yet they persevered, because in the rigid hierarchy of Versailles, your appearance was your power, your currency, your very survival. To appear unfashionable or poorly groomed meant social death, which in that world was often followed by literal death, exile, poverty, and disgrace. But perhaps nothing illustrates the horrific contradiction of their lives more than mealtime at Versailles. Picture the most elaborate dinner party you've ever attended, then multiply it by 1,000. Tables stretching the length of ballrooms, groaning under the weight of roasted peacocks, sugar sculptures that took artisans weeks to create, wines that had aged longer than most people lived. The greatest chefs in Europe competed to serve these women delicacies that would make modern food critics weep with joy. Yet behind the golden plates and crystal goblets lay a secret that would turn your stomach. The palace plumbing system, what little existed, was so poorly designed that sewage would regularly back up into the kitchen areas. Raw female waste would bubble up through floor drains while cooks prepared meals for the king's table. The smell was so overwhelming that cooks would often vomit while cooking, adding their own sickness to the contamination. Food safety, as we understand it, simply didn't exist. Meat would hang in warm kitchens for days, slowly rotting while still being served to the highest nobility in France. Milk would sour in the heat, then be used anyway in sauces and desserts. Fruits and vegetables grown in soil contaminated with human waste from the palace's overflowing cesspits would be served fresh and unwashed. The result was predictable and horrifying. Nearly every woman at court suffered from chronic digestive problems. Dysentery was so common that it was simply called the court complaint. Vomiting during meals became so routine that special servants, called sickness attendants, would stand behind each diner's chair with bowls and towels.
But the most horrifying detail came from the king's own physician, who documented that parasites, intestinal worms, were found in nearly every member of the royal family. The king himself once passed a tapeworm that measured 6 feet in length. The queen's autopsy revealed her intestines were so packed with worms that the examining physician initially thought he was looking at a nest of snakes. These women, these paragons of beauty and sophistication, would sit through elaborate 5-course dinners, making witty conversation and delicate small talk, while privately battling nausea, cramps, and the constant fear that they might soil themselves before they could excuse themselves from the table. And then came the most public, most vulnerable moment of any noblewoman's life: childbirth. In our modern world, we understand that birth is an intimate, private moment that should be surrounded by medical care and emotional support. At Versailles, it was a spectator sport. When a queen or high-ranking duchess went into labor, word would spread through the palace like wildfire. Courtiers would rush to witness the event not out of concern or celebration, but because royal births had to be observed to prevent any possibility of deception. The room would fill with dozens, sometimes hundreds of people: nobles, servants, physicians, priests, foreign ambassadors, and curious onlookers who had bribed their way in. Marie Antoinette's first birth was attended by so many people that the room became dangerously hot and overcrowded. She fainted from the heat and lack of air, nearly dying not from complications of childbirth, but from suffocation in a room packed with spectators, treating her labor like a theatrical performance. But the crowd was only part of the horror. Medical knowledge was primitive at best, deadly at worst. Physicians believed that a woman in labor shouldn't drink water because it would cool her inner fire. They thought pain was necessary for a healthy birth, so they provided no relief for women who might labor for days. Most shocking of all, they never washed their hands or instruments, believing that cleanliness was unnecessary since birth was natural. The mortality rate tells the story. Of Queen Marie Therese's 6 pregnancies, only 1 child survived to adulthood. Marie Antoinette buried 3 of her 4 children. These weren't statistics. These were personal tragedies that played out while crowds watched and whispered. The emotional toll on these women was staggering. They were expected to maintain perfect composure while experiencing not just physical agony, but the humiliation of having their most vulnerable moments witnessed by people who saw them as entertainment rather than human beings in need of care and comfort. Yet somehow, through all of this, the filth, the disease, the public humiliation, the constant discomfort, these women maintained an image of perfection that has endured for centuries. They smiled through their pain, danced despite their illnesses, and created an impression of grace and beauty so powerful that we still reference it today when we think of elegance and sophistication. The truth is, they were performers in the most challenging role ever written, appearing to be living fairy tale princesses while actually surviving conditions that would challenge the strongest among us. Their strength wasn't in their beauty or their wealth. It was in their ability to endure, to adapt, and to somehow find moments of genuine joy and connection despite living in what can only be described as a beautiful nightmare. When we look at portraits of these women today, their pale faces perfectly powdered, their elaborate gowns billowing around them like clouds, their hair arranged in impossible spirals reaching toward heaven, we're not just seeing fashion or art, we're seeing survivors. Women who found ways to maintain their humanity, their dignity, and their spirit despite living in conditions that would break many of us today. Their legacy isn't just in the beautiful objects they left behind or the buildings that still bear their names. It's in their reminder that true strength often looks like weakness, that real beauty often hides beneath layers of suffering, and that the human spirit can endure almost anything while still finding reasons to hope, to love, and to believe in tomorrow. The next time you take a hot shower, use a clean bathroom, or enjoy a meal prepared in a sanitary kitchen, remember the Duchess Elizabeth Charlotte and her fellow survivors of Versailles. Remember that what we consider basic human rights were luxuries beyond their wildest dreams, and that perhaps our modern definition of strength needs to include the quiet endurance of those who came before us, who paved the way for the freedoms we now take for granted. This is their story. Not the sanitized version found in fairy tales, but the real, raw, beautiful, and terrible truth of what it meant to be a woman in the most glamorous prison ever built. And perhaps in understanding their struggles, we can better appreciate not just our own lives, but the incredible resilience of the human spirit itself.